to the second part of our study, or it's not really the second half, but there's 2 points, and we'll begin with point number 2 in our study this evening, where it's talking about, of course, dealing with temptations and dealing with it the right way, and we're using Joseph as the example. Let's be reminded, just as a quick review here, that we looked at in the book of Proverbs, the young man, the simple-minded, the one who was void of wisdom and maturity, how that he was led the wrong way by this woman who was looking for men, finding him. She used her, she seduced him. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time. He didn't resist, or he faced the wrong appeal. He gave in to her sins, and she, of course, we didn't take the time to pick out some of the lies that are incorporated into this, but there's several things that she said to him that were not true, and yet they were meant to draw him into her house. And we see, as we concluded last week, that he fell. His actions were not overlooked. They were not good. He was condemned. And he was likened to an animal going to the slaughter. And how that sometimes temptation is presented to each of us, and yet, because we don't count the cost, or because we don't view it all the way to the end, we may only see, for example, pleasures or wealth or something like that, rather than seeing the end of it all, and that being separation from that of God, and of course being led astray from our conduct, our righteousness before that of God. Now, that's the way Satan works. We took a few minutes last week to identify him. He's a deceiver. He'll lie. He'll do anything that he can. He knows us at our weakest moment. He knows our weakest points. He is like a lion that is just prowling about, seeking whom he may devour, looking for Christians, looking for those of God's people, that he might be able to lead them again, or lead them away from that of being that of the servant of God. So in conclusion of that, and begin tonight, we need to not only be aware that the devil is walking about, but we can see the consequences of it here. And we need to be aware of the consequences and the danger that is associated with that of temptation. Now, we know from the book of James is one place that we're strengthened by these trials. We overcome them, and we're closer, we're stronger, we're more committed, and that's what it should produce within us as God's children. But if we go into these things blindly, or with a preconceived idea that sin won't touch us, or sin won't hurt us, or temptation, then of course we're going to get in trouble. And this is what happened to this young man here. He should have identified, and the way when we read this, we can see how all of this plays out from beginning to end. But yet also, this is not this exact situation, but very similar to this, is enacted and reacted every day in people's lives. They're led astray by smooth sayings, by teaching of what might, just what might be good, not necessarily what is good. And of course that comes from, as I pointed out last week, creation of doubt. When there is doubt and not a firm grip on that of the Word of God, then we very easily can be led astray by the things we hear and by the things that are done by others, simply because we want to be like them, or we might see the success of them in some way, rather than the success of being spiritually right with God. So we have to control and have self-control. And we need to, as God's children, we have this self-control, and even, and I hope I can say this right, even before the temptation comes. We school ourselves in Scripture. We know of Joseph. No one should ever make the same or a similar mistake as, not Joseph, the young man here in Proverbs, the 7th chapter. But they do. They do over and over and over again. So example after example is given. We could look at others, that of those who sinned and transgressed God's law, and many of them were destroyed. But yet people still do the same thing over and over. And it's because they haven't determined, they don't have a predetermination to stay away from temptation and to overcome temptation. As someone said somewhere along the line, the best way to deal with temptation is at the first inkling, the first note, the first feeling of that of temptation is get away. Don't stay there. Don't put yourself in that situation. And so remove yourself from it. And I think that is a good saying, and of course a good practice for us to look at. Now, on the other hand, we talk about Joseph. And so we begin tonight to talk about not necessarily in contrast, because if we look at it in contrast, we're losing a greater part. I mean, we could say, okay, this young man dealt with it wrong and Joseph dealt with it right. Okay, that's just simply a contrast. But we're going to go into more detail than that. We're going to look at some things that I believe will help us in understanding Joseph, and of course the right way to deal with that of temptation. Now, right at the beginning, let's learn this and let's accept this in our mind. This temptation of Joseph, just like I said about the young man, it's real. It's not, it wasn't, this is not just a story. This is not just some fable. This is real. So the actions of Joseph are real. It's his reactions or actions that he takes. That's what we learn from. That's what we're going to pick up on. We begin reading in Genesis 39 and verses 6 and 7, where, of course, he's a part of Potiphar's household. And it says, thus he, Potiphar, left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. He was in charge. Joseph was in charge. He gave him this charge. He gave it to him because he respected him, he trusted him, and I don't know how this would compare to any other of the responsibilities of any other of Potiphar's rule or reign, but it seems to me like he was way up there. Now notice in the very next phrase, now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Not every verse says handsome. There are some verses that translated as Joseph was a good person. He was a goodly person, a godly person. One says that he was well favored. But I believe in looking at what I can as far as reading and understanding, I know from other scriptures, even what follows here in verse 7, that Potiphar's wife had saw an appeal from that of Joseph. She saw that he was good looking, that he was handsome, and so on. Look at verse 7. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife, casting longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, lie with me. Now, I don't think it was his riches that caused her to feel this way. I don't think it was his power that Potiphar had given him that caused her to do this. So it could have been very well that he was handsome, and his appearance was one that was pleasing. And so she sees him, and she just, after some period of time, notice that in verse 7, after it came to pass, she says unto him, lie with me. Now this presents the situation that we're going to be discussing in the verses that follow. Number one, let's note that Joseph here is said that he was in charge. He was trusted. He was one who was given this responsibility, no doubt because he was honest. There was nothing in Potiphar's house except his wife that he did not have control over. Secondly, here's Potiphar's wife. Now, it's easy to understand her as being one who saw Joseph and was making the advances here. Notice in verse 7, it came to pass that after these things, that the master of his wife cast longing eyes. Now that's the New King James Version. She saw him. She looked at him. And she desired him. And she says to him, lie with me. Now I want you to remember a verse over in the New Testament that we sometimes, and I know before we even read the passage, that it's talking about a man looking at a woman. But in Matthew, the 5th chapter, is the passage that tells us, I think it's chapter 5 in verse 28. This is the passage that teaches us that whoever looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now when she cast longing eyes on him, I think that says much about her character, much about what she desired to do, and much about how much she wanted Joseph. Because in the verse that we have, she looked at him, she desired him, and she says unto him, lie with me. I mean, no question about what was on her mind. But I do want to point out that she cast longing eyes on it. If that be the case with anybody, that right there should stop whatever the temptation may be. It may be another person. It may be a boat. But when you cast longing eyes, when you desire it so much that you feel like you have it, it's yours, whether it's yours or not, then we're in danger. So she saw him, and she saw that he was handsome, and she desired then to lay with him. And so she asked him, a very straightforward question. She asked him, lie with me. Now I want you to notice, as we're reading this from the Bible, that's Genesis 39 and verses 6 and 7. Verse 8 says, he refused. He refused. He didn't say, okay, let me think about it a while. She didn't come out as the harlot in Proverbs 7 and say, hey, look here, I got everything ready. I've been looking for you now. You're the one I'm looking for. Everything's all right now. I've got perfume all over everything. The finest of things out. My husband's gone. You come out here. She didn't do that. She cast longing eyes on him. He refused. I want us in our minds to see here that her intentions versus his intentions. He refused. He didn't say, okay, nobody's going to know about this anyway. He didn't say, well, maybe just this one time. He didn't say that. He refused. I see that as a straightforward answer of not leaving her any doubt as as to where he would lay with her. He refused. But that didn't stop him. Let's finish reading verse 8. Then he refused and said to his master's wife, Look, behold, my master does not know what is with me, or what is with me in the house. He has committed all things into his hand. He says, in other words, he didn't even know what all, Potiphar didn't know what all he had, but he did. Joseph did. He said, that's a responsibility I have. It's under my control. Then he says, there is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you. He didn't say, okay, you know what, we'll keep it hid from him. He'll never know it. Potiphar will never draw any idea. I got control of everything. Eventually something will happen to Potiphar, and then we'll have one another and be together as long as we want. He didn't say that. He says, I have control of everything that's here except you, his wife. Now I want you to see the difference already in the language of what we saw in Proverbs 7 and what we're looking at here. The difference in the language is that Joseph here is his answers are straightforward, plain, and not hard to understand. He refused. Then he says, of all the things that Potiphar owns, you're the only thing he holds back from me. Now look at verse 9, or we've read part of verse 9. He says, he's held back you. And then notice in the last part of verse 9, how then can I do this great wickedness? Now he's already mentioned here that she was the only thing that Potiphar held back. He wouldn't lay with her. He refused. As a matter of fact, he's going to flee in a few minutes. But what we learn here is there's something else in Joseph's mind. Something else helps him to weigh the balance as to whether this is right and wrong. First thing he answered is, he says, I'm going to be true to Potiphar. He trusted me. He gave me this control. I'm going to be true to him, and I'm not going to touch his wife. But look what else he says in the closing of verse 9. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Sin against God. You see, it wasn't just the fact that it was a sin among them that would have transpired, but Joseph answered to God. He says, I can't do this in sin against God. It's wicked. I can't be a part of it. Now, I'm not going to stand here and say we have every word of the conversation, but I don't believe Joseph responded like this. She said, or she saw him and she thought he was handsome, and I don't think at all Joseph ever said, well, I tell you right now, you're the prettiest woman in the world. You're the prettiest one I've ever seen. I don't think he led her along at all. I think he was very plain in what he was saying. So, he was tempted from the very start. He refused from the very start. He didn't entertain excuses. He didn't try to find some way to better the situation for his profit or for her profit. He simply says, I can't do this to Potiphar, and even greater than that, I can't sin against God. So what else was left for him to do? If you look at verse 10, she continued her advances toward him day by day. It wasn't just a one thing and over. Day by day, as Joseph went about his job and she was near him, he did not heed her. He didn't listen. He didn't wear her down. He didn't let his thoughts justify what she had suggested to him. He didn't allow himself to finally decide, well, maybe this is not too bad. But day by day, every day that he was near her, he did not heed her. Now, let me give you some different translations of that. He didn't listen to her. Could he hear? I'm sure he could. I'm sure physically he could hear, but he didn't listen to her. He didn't listen to her because he had refused to entertain her suggestion. So he refused, and he gave no consent at all that this was a good thing. And so he refused to listen to the woman. Now, that's where sometimes we wear down. The temptation to sin is there, it's there, it's there, it's there. And maybe over a period of time, it lessens in our mind. The consequences don't seem as great. It doesn't seem as wicked as it once did. A person may even justify in their mind how that they would eventually think that it's okay. I think some people can do that, but it's still sin and it's still wrong. But he never once, in the presence of this woman, did he ever listen to her. And it seems like she never quit. Have you noticed that? He avoided even her presence in verse 39, in verse 10. Notice he said that he did not heed her, to lie with her, or to be with her. He didn't put himself in that situation. Now, there's a lot of people today, well, you're dying of thirst, and you don't have anything, no water to drink or anything like that. Is it all right to go into a bar to get a bottle of water? I think that's straining a point. I think we're missing something there. I think we're missing, we're trying to justify where really in some cases, a person could go in for a bottle of water, come straight back out there and they're not bothered. But you're putting yourself in a bad situation. Another person go in for a bottle of water, and they may end up drunk. So we have to think through what this means and how the consequences of it plays out. So he avoided her presence, but she didn't give up. She didn't give up. So she finally confronts him in verses 11 and 12. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work. It was his responsibilities. It's what he was given that he was to do. He went in, and he went in with a right mind and to fulfill his responsibilities. And he says he went in to do his work, and none of the men of the house were inside. So he and her were alone. She caught hold of him. Now, all the advances before had been verbal that we see. She grabbed a hold of him. She grabbed a hold of his garment. Again, she says, lie with me. What did he do? Oh, don't tear him a coat. You're going to break a button off of it or anything. Wait just a minute now. What did he do? But he left his garment in her hand, and he fled. And he went outside. It didn't matter that he left his garment in there. I mean, she's going to use it against him in just a few moments. But fleeing meant more to him than whatever this jacket or whatever garment that he had lost. It meant more to him to be right with God and be clothed spiritually. I keep saying spiritually. Understand this is under the old law. Be clothed spiritually than to be clothed physically. So she caught him. she took him by the hand, or she took him by this outer garment. Again, she tells him what she wants. And he fled, and he ran outside. Now, I want us, if you're there to Genesis 39, I want us to read just a few more verses before we go on to the next point here. In 39, let's begin reading at verse 13. Let's get into this a little bit more. 39 and verse 13. And so it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of the house and spoke to them, saying, See, he has brought in to us a Hebrew to mock us, to make fun of us, to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. That was the accepted norm at the time. And it happened, when they heard that I lifted my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept his garment with her until his master come home. Then she spoke to him the words of these, saying, The Hebrew servant whom you brought in to us came in to me and mocked me. So it happened, as I lifted my voice and cried, that he lifted his garment with me, and fled outside. So it was, when the master heard the words which the wife had spoken to him, saying, Your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. Now, I wanted to read that because, again, that tells us the type of the woman that he's dealing with. She just lied, just the whole thing. She just made it up. He come in here and he laughed at us. He made fun of us. Or here's his garment. I can prove to you that he's been here. And what happens then? He ends up in prison. He ends up in a den, really, a cave-like. So that didn't change him then. He still, notice the next point here, point F. He maintained his purity and innocence and integrity. Perhaps he could have said, no, wait a minute, Mr. Potiphar. I love my job, and I'll do anything to keep my job. And maybe that did happen if you'll just let me keep my job and get what money and what I have. He didn't say that. He never caved in under pressure. His faithfulness and steadfastness to God, his integrity, his reasoning, his ability to use wisdom, which the young man didn't use and didn't have back in over in Proverbs 7, brought him to the point not of being led through the town and praised because he was a good, faithful person, but led him to be persecuted as a prisoner because Potiphar's wife had lied on him. Now, not only did he maintain his purity, innocence, and his integrity, but he avoided temptation every step of the way. Now, let me suggest to you some things. That didn't indicate that Joseph was weak. As a matter of fact, I believe he was strong. Didn't mean there was something wrong with Joseph when he wouldn't lay with Potiphar's wife. I believe he was strong. I believe he was dedicated to God and dedicated to that of Potiphar. So every step of the way, it shows strength in Joseph, how to overcome this temptation. Just, if you will, the situation being different with that of the young man and that of Proverbs 7. Now, having looked at this, let's look at the conclusion, and then we'll quit for the evening. He had a trust in God that no matter what the situation was, that he was not going to change. It didn't matter. I mean, I don't know what he gave up. I don't know the riches. I know the power that he had because it's explained to us. That didn't matter to him. He wanted to be right with God. He wanted to make sure that God was with him. So he did not choose to break God's law at any time. Even though it may not have been the norm. Even though it may not have been a popular thing. Potiphar's wife lied on him and he ended up in prison. So, trusting God sometimes causes us to be stronger because we overcome temptations because of him. None of us have the right to pat ourselves on the chest and say, I done this or I done that. We do it with the help of God. It is God who leads us through. It's God who led Joseph through. His strength, as we could go on with Joseph, his resilience, the responsibilities that he had was one that the story's not over with Joseph. This is just a bad chapter in that of his life. But contrasting to the void of understanding of that of the young man, look at how this could have been different if Joseph would have been senseless without wisdom like this young boy. Look how his anchor, being in that of God and his word, his trust and his confidence in that of God being the very anchor of his life, how it led him through all of these temptations. I mean, not just one time was she after him. It says day by day. Day by day. So Joseph had determined and made this a part of his life. Maybe I should say predetermined, but we know of his determination as well. That he did not want to sin against God. He didn't want to sin against God. Now let me illustrate one point here that to me gives me some insight in all of this. She was making advances at Joseph, and she was Potiphar's wife, the scripture says. But even if Potiphar would have said to Joseph, you can have anything in my house, you can even have my wife, I'm not sure Joseph would have reacted any different. Because he knew that was a sin. He knew that was wickedness. And so something that might seem to be, that we might have the permission for, or we might feel like we're due ourselves or we owe to ourselves, doesn't make a situation right. Because whatever the situation was, whether, and like I say, I'm just using this here as to make a point, whether he said you can have everything in here but her, or you can have everything in here except her, Joseph would have reacted the same, because God was first and foremost in his life. He did not allow these things to take away from his service to God. So the lesson is that we need to have the wisdom that comes from God's word, how to overcome and let temptations have their way, or their strengthening of us, their proving of us, as we use read about the proofing of the metals and so on. And so, even though, as James says, we are tried, we're tried by fire, yet our works needs to be proved to God. They'll come through shining, and that's what I see in Joseph. Here was a man who had every opportunity, if you want to say it, use that as some people use it today, to sin. And he didn't. He would not give in. Any comments before we quit this evening?
I think that shows a lot about Joseph when he reveals himself to his brothers. maybe we can look back and see that he was humble and decided to follow God. And you know, he never, look at all the evils done to him.
Yep. Right.
He sold into slavery.
Right.
And then lied upon him, thrown into prison and everything.
I just wonder how his brothers felt when he finally revealed himself to them. You know, that's almost a moment that would shock anybody. They thought he was gone, they had mistreated him, and now the very one that could help them survive is the one that was in control. Yeah, this is just one event in the life of that of Joseph. Anything else? We're going to sing Are You Coming to Jesus Tonight? Most of us are Christians, but there might be a need in someone to make your life right or make correction in your life. And so we're going to sing this song for your encouragement. And there's never a time that we should live or try to live with sin in our life. And so if you have a need to correct your life, let us know as together we stand and while we sing.